A terrible wrong was put right by Nico Hulkenberg's shock third-place finish in the British Grand Prix. On his 239th F1 start, Hulkenberg finally stood on the podium for the first time, shedding the record of being, statistically, Formula One's most prolific failure. The unenviable record for most starts without a podium finish in F1, which Hulkenberg has now handed back to Adrian Sutil, was viewed by many as a badge of dishonour. Some used it as a stick to beat Hulkenberg with, proof there was something wrong with him, a fragility that made him choke when opportunity knocked. Now it can't be used against him. That Hulkenberg hadn't bagged a podium before now was largely about happenstance. Often in the wrong place at the wrong time, the occasional flirtation with Ferrari never yielded a top drive, and he spent most of his career fighting for minor points, 90 times finishing between 7th and 11th. Before last Sunday's British Grand Prix, Hulkenberg had driven for teams that took a grand total of 4 podiums during his time there, all 4 of those falling to Sergio Perez, one of which, at Monaco in 2016, should by rights have been Hulkenberg's, but for poor Force India pit strategy. It wasn't the career Hulkenberg looked destined for when he arrived in F1 in 2010, touted by many as a future world champion after a stellar record in the junior categories, but it's still been a remarkable one. He has his limitations, and there have been mistakes, and it's those rough edges that mean he never quite managed to make himself the first choice for a top team. But there's always been a quality driver there, and that's why he's been on the grid for so long. Only 14 drivers in history have started more Grand Prix than Hulkenberg has. You don't take pole in Brazil in your rookie season in a midfield Williams in mixed conditions, or race the McLarens for victory in the 2012 Brazilian Grand Prix in a Force India without being a seriously good driver. Carlos Sainz was teammate to Hulkenberg at Renault for the final races of 2017 and in 2018. He says the fact Hulkenberg didn't have a podium to his name until now is circumstantial, and hopes this result will finally shut up everyone who doubted him. Hulkenberg has always been highly rated within the F1 paddock, and although his career looked in real danger of petering out after he was released by Renault so they could partner Daniel Ricciardo with Esteban Ocon for 2020, Haas dumping Mick Schumacher at the end of 2022 gave Hulkenberg a new lease of life. Hulkenberg has really taken to this generation of cars, adopting a momentum-based driving style that relies on carrying corner speed and letting the car do the work. It's been tremendously effective and earned him the right to spearhead Audi's F1 return when Sauber becomes its works team in 2026. There may be more podium chances with Sauber Audi in the future, and he'll certainly hope so, but if the first one is the only one, and there's a chance it will be, then at least the terrible injustice of that podiumless record has finally been fixed. There was near universal joy within the F1 paddock at Hulkenberg finally achieving a long overdue result. Max Verstappen was the first of many drivers to congratulate Hulkenberg personally, and both Aston Martin and Mercedes sent bottles of champagne to Sauber to help power the celebrations. Hulkenberg himself called the experience surreal, but he also was the first to acknowledge how favourable circumstances played into his hands, saying, "Today is obviously circumstantial. If we had a dry race, it would have been a very different day and outcome for us." But that dose of realism also underplays the job Hulkenberg and Sauber both did, in a race where several other teams and drivers were better placed to capitalise on the chaos Silverstone threw at them. Mercedes made an absolute mess of its strategy calls. Charles Leclerc drove one of the worst races of his F1 career. Aston Martin failed to capitalise on its more favourable track position, and Haas failed even to score a point with what, in Ollie Behrman's hands, was undoubtedly the fastest midfield car of the lot when the track was dry. Finishing third from 19th on the grid rarely happens in F1 unless you have by far the fastest car at your disposal and qualify out of position, or you get a bit fortunate from others making mistakes. But you also need to execute your own race well, and this is where Hulkenberg and Sauber were excellent. Key to this race were 3 vital strategy calls. Number 1, staying on the intermediate tyres for the first stint, rather than gambling on slicks on a half-wet, half-dry track with virtual safety car periods preventing drivers getting proper energy into those dry tyres. Number 2, swapping those worn intermediates for newer tyres before the heavy rain came and the safety car came out, allowing Hulkenberg to gain time on drivers who stayed out too long on badly worn tyres, and then track position on those who had to pit under the safety car. And number 3, not jumping from worn intermediates to slicks too early in the final part of the race when the track was still treacherous and many drivers flew off the road and lost time, including Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari, which was pursuing Hulkenberg and stopped for slicks only 1 lap before. Charles Leclerc and George Russell both fell foul of the first call, lost vital track position and never really recovered. Fernando Alonso lost out badly on points 1 and 3, swapping from worn inters to new ones too late, then swapping from worn inters to slicks too early. He finished 9th, when until his final pit stop he'd been not far behind Pierre Gasly, who finished 6th. The other key point was how well Hulkenberg's Sauber used its tyres as the track dried out later in the race. Alonso's Aston Martin teammate Lance Stroll was even better positioned than Hulkenberg once all the early safety car chaos had shaken out, but Stroll struggled so badly on worn intermediates and on the soft compound slicks Aston fitted after Stroll got overtaken by Hulkenberg that Stroll eventually dropped out of the top 6 completely on the final lap of the race, suffering with what he called huge degradation. It's difficult to know how much of that is down to the car and how much is down to the driver. At the previous race in Austria, Alonso managed to make the finish on 1 stop, one of only 2 drivers, the other being Racing Bull's Liam Lawson, to do so. Stroll suffered much worse in the high temperatures, made 2 stops and finished well outside the points. We saw how unsuited Max Verstappen's skinny rear wing was to the wet conditions at Silverstone compared to the dry weather of qualifying when he set pole position. But although he clearly struggled for grip in the early part of the race, spun during a safety car restart, and generally found his Red Bull horrible to drive on race day, he still came back through to 5th, 2 places ahead of Stroll. So we have to give Hulkenberg and Sauber credit for the way they collectively managed this race. There was some luck involved certainly, but it was also a brilliantly executed Grand Prix with a car that since its Barcelona upgrade has become a proper threat in the fight to be best of the rest behind F1's 4 biggest teams. The team that will soon morph into Audi's new Works F1 operation has gone from plumb last at the end of 2024 to 6th in the space of just half a season. It's an impressive turnaround, one that seemed unlikely given how poorly Sauber did throughout last year and how difficult its start to 2025 was. But Sauber is now the 4th highest scoring team over the past 4 races, ahead of Red Bull, and Hulkenberg is the 6th highest scoring driver in the World Championship in that time, ahead of Verstappen. The explanation for how that's happened can broadly be broken down into 3 areas. First, Sauber was not a completely hopeless last in 2024. OK, in points terms its return was terrible, and there were times through the year when its car was ruthlessly exposed and it was quite clearly F1's slowest. But it could have scored points early on had a couple of races gone a little differently, and problems like bad pit stops or engine unreliability hadn't thwarted Valtteri Bottas. And in the final quarter of the season, as an upgraded car started to show more potential, Sauber was quicker than Williams and equal to Aston Martin, showing it actually made more progress in the midfield than the headline results suggest. And it had quietly built a decent foundation by the end of 2024. The second factor is the way the team kicked on from there. While 2025 started a little underwhelmingly as others made bigger initial steps over the winter, Sauber's development work was still ongoing, and as the 2025 car has evolved into its true form, particularly the all-new floor fitted at Barcelona and evolved since, it has become increasingly competitive. And Sauber has clearly developed into a sharper, more effective race team too. That transformation had already got underway last year and has been further boosted by the arrival of Jonathan Wheatley from Red Bull as team principal. Frankly, the Sauber of 18 months ago would not have inspired much confidence in a rain-hit race, where judging the chaos is so critical, but at present, Sauber seems a lot more assured. Ironically though, Sauber's pit stops weren't stunningly good at Silverstone. Of the 34 made in the race, Hulkenberg's were the 30th and 32nd best. Wheatley, who previously played a key role in how Red Bull became the class leader in pit stops, reckoned there were a little bit of nerves in the pit crew and that its relatively young team is still building confidence. That's a good indicator of the room Sauber still has to grow. But there's the third element to consider too, and that is rivals underachieving. Alpine is the obvious example, with Renault's team sitting last in the championship, but big budget Aston Martin also started 2025 slowly, and Williams has gone from the class of the midfield to misfiring in recent races for various reasons. Plus, if we take the great aforementioned comparison of how much Sauber has outscored Red Bull of late, that is obviously exaggerated by Red Bull being basically a one-car team at the moment. Wheatley's not immediately made his new team better than his old one. But despite all of that, Hulkenberg's podium was there for the taking for any team, and it speaks volumes for Sauber's progress that not only was it in contention, something that was impossible to imagine last year, it was actually capable of taking it. The same goes for Hulkenberg himself, who has finally shown he can close out a big F1 result. Wheatley is convinced that Hulkenberg can achieve more and become a race winner in the right car. It'll be a long time before the Works Audi team fights for regular podium finishes, let alone wins, but it looks to be on the right trajectory, and the perception of its lead driver has just been nudged upwards too. And maybe the next time Hulkenberg finishes on the podium, if there is a next time, he might be fortunate enough to win a trophy made of something other than Lego.